Hey everyone, and thanks for choosing to spend your noon slot with me. Real quick about me, I have about 9 years of experience in the industry, and most of that has been on big AAA projects such as Assassin's Creed Origins, Assassin's Creed Valhalla, major DLCs for both, notably the Dawn of Ragnarok DLC, which will become relevant later. And I am currently the design director on the as yet unannounced Project 8 with 11-bit studios. But enough about me. Why have you come here today? What were you expecting to hear about? I bet it was time. This precious resource that we all have, and we all have to decide how to spend. Now, what does that have to do with games? Well, once upon a time, games were short, they were simple, there weren't that many of them. So really, when you put something out on the market, you had a pretty good bet that people could play it and play all of it fully, just fully enjoy whatever you decided to put into this product. Now, things are a bit different. Now, games are these big, sprawling experiences with many moving parts that take in the tens, if not hundreds of hours to complete. And not only that, but we have plenty of them. So, Tears of the Kingdom is out right now, but just a couple of weeks ago, we had Jedi Survivor come out. Just in a couple of weeks, we have Diablo 4 coming out. So titles aren't really waiting for you to play the 200 hours that it's going to take you to probably complete this to satisfaction. So when we do games now, we really have to figure out how do we make them so that players, when they're deciding what game to pick up and how to spend their time in it, can get the most out of your game. So focus design, what it means and what it means to me specifically. So when it comes to design, there are plenty of theories that you can find, plenty of schools of thought on design. What this is none of them. Focus design is my personal approach to how I view design. So I want to make this very clear at the start. What you're going to hear about today, as pompous as it sounds, it's not an apocryphal approach to design that you might not have heard yet. It's my own opinion of how I tend to approach design in order to make sure that the games that I work on deliver the best possible experience to the players that play them. A bit more about what that means. So I mentioned how games have a lot of moving parts, but hey, metaphors are fluid, so they're also like puzzles. Puzzles that have a whole bunch of pieces that need to fit together to form a coherent picture, something that is pleasant to view, to play by your players. And they have many different things in them. They have progression systems, they have fight systems, they have traversal systems, they have control schemes, they have mini-games. We're looking for something to put in that puzzle that's going to fit the big picture. And sometimes we end up with games that have found something to put in that slot, but it doesn't quite fit the overall picture. And maybe it doesn't always hurt the overall picture, but it doesn't help it either. So this is what I'm going to attempt to talk to you about today, is how do we make sure that our games present a whole big coherent picture. Now, to do that, I'm going to be giving some examples of games that I've worked on, of games that I've played, and naturally, some of those examples are going to be of things that are, yes, I think that was done very well to achieve focus design. Sometimes it's going to be things that I would have done differently. Now, please note that when I give those examples, that doesn't mean I hate the game. That doesn't mean I don't think the game is good. All it means is that that particular thing that I'm mentioning, I would have done differently. And maybe you like it just the way it is, and that's fine. But anyway, now that this is out of the way, what are we actually going to go through today? I would like to spend some time talking about why this is even important, why I think it's important to talk about focus design. I also want to talk about a couple of common offenders, so things that we tend to see often in games that we probably shouldn't see as often. And then at the end, I'm going to give you my own process of how I tend to approach design with a few examples of big features that me and my teams have worked on over the years. But all right, one by one. Why is this something important? The first reason it's important to talk about focus design is very mundane and obvious. Things cost money to develop. You need a designer to design your feature, you need programmers to make it real, you need art to actually make it potable in your game, then you might have a whole bunch of other things that need to happen, animation, audio, voiceover, localization, whatever, and then it needs to be tested. All of those things, time costs money, so it's prudent to make sure that whatever they're working on actually helps the game out and in the end is worthwhile. So again, this is mundane and probably obvious. The other two things that I want to talk about are probably less so. They're costs that we incur on the player side when we introduce a new feature. The first thing is something I like to think of as the cost to learn whatever you've included in your game. And that I like to think about in two dimensions: the complexity of whatever you're trying to have your players learn, and then its impact on the game. And if we take a look at an outlier, something that is both quite complex to learn but also has quite a big impact on the game, let's look at Redstone in Minecraft. For those of you who might not be familiar, Redstone is essentially the electricity of Minecraft. It lets you do things such as flip a switch and have a door open to basically enable you to build a computer inside of Minecraft. Now, obviously, that second part is rather complex. You need a good grasp of logic gates. You need to figure out how the redstone switches work. You need to figure out how to lay down the redstone wires, all of it. So it's obviously complex. You need to spend a lot of time learning how to do this. However, doing so, investing this time, also has a very big impact on the game. It gives you something very Minecrafty. It lets you fulfill, or it lets you deliver on that expectation of being able to build anything you want inside that game. So it's time well spent to learn, and a lot of people enjoy doing it. Now let's take a look at something on the other end of the spectrum, something that's not very complex to learn and doesn't have a huge impact on the game. Who remembers this? Hey, fellow old-timers. This is Posak from the original Knights of the Old Republic game. It's the first minigame that I personally fell in love with. It's basically a versus form of blackjack. So you're trying to get as close to a number as possible without going over it, and you have a hand of cards that you can use to modify the final result. That's it. It's as simple as that. When you play it, you get some credits. You can use them to buy some stuff, so not a very big impact on the game. Some, but not very big, but also super easy to grasp. To move things into a bit of the modern era, recognize this? Yeah. Holotactics from the new Jedi Survivor game. It follows in the footsteps of its esteemed predecessor in that it's super accessible. It's essentially an auto-battler. All you do is pick a team of guys, they get deployed to a table, and they fight the other guys. Automatically, you don't have to do anything. For your trouble, you get some cosmetics at the beginning, and then at the very end, when you complete all of it, you get an item with some gameplay relevance. So, again, super low investment to actually learn how to play this, and some impact on the game. Now, Machine Strike also exists. Machine Strike is the, I hesitate to call it mini, but it's the game inside Horizon Forbidden West. It's a board game that you can find in different settlements and play it with the people there. Machine Strike has different units that don't only have different statistics, they also have different abilities, different attack arcs, different terrain types that matter for the game. On your turn, the units can perform different things. They can either rush forward or they can move and attack, but there's a lot of moving parts to this. For your trouble, you generally get a bit of money and a new piece for Machine Strike. So learning to get good at Machine Strike gives you absolutely nothing long-term in Forbidden West. Hence, not a whole lot of people actually play this past the first several games where it's just, let's see what this is. Now, I'd like to point out, I think that Machine Strike is a much better game than either Posak or Holotactics. It just happens to be a poorer choice, in my opinion, for a mini-game to put inside of a video game. Because again, people who sit down to play Forbidden West, they want to play Forbidden West and then they want to be able to get to the next thing. Asking them to invest cognitive energy to just learn how to do this for a while, for not really anything that gets them closer to completing the game, is a big ask. And that's only the first ask that those mini-games do, because the next cost that we incur to players with features that we introduce is the cost to player time. The mini-games are actually a good example of this as well. Posak and Holotactics are very quick. Machine Strike takes a while. But I really want to talk about Marvel's Midnight Suns, probably the poster child of how it asks players to spend its time in the last half a year or so. Essentially, this is actually a good example of a game that I really, really like. And still, I have something to say about it in terms of its design. So Marvel's Midnight Suns is essentially a tactical XCOM-y type thing, which is card-driven. And it has a 4 ways that I've been able to identify in which it asks players to spend their time. The first one is the most obvious one. It's the tactical layer where you go on a mission with your guys, you use cards to battle other guys. This is the essence of the game. This is why most people would buy Midnight Suns. They want to play this. This part is brilliant. It's amazing. In between missions, the game also asks you to explore the Abbey, which is your home base. Now, already here, some people are starting to go, this is not the tactical thing that I wanted to do. And I get it. Me personally, I was fine with this bit because exploring a new place was just interesting because of the joy of discovering secrets, new passages, new things. So this was kind of fine to me. The next thing that the game asks you to do is build relationships with your team. I am a fan of Marvel Comics. I enjoy hearing Tony Stark interact with Spider-Man as much as the next guy. But having to spend a bunch of time talking to my teammates just in order to get them from 1 to 5 friendship, and each level takes a while, takes a few interactions to do. There are 12 teammates in the base game, 16 with all DLCs. It takes a while to do. Unfortunately, getting them up to maximum friendship also has very real game benefits because it gives the associated team member very useful bonuses during the tactical layer of the game, which is what you want to be playing. So the game is very much asking me to be sinking a lot of time into a dating sim that I didn't really sign up for when I bought an XCOM game. The worst offender, though, to me, in terms of Midnight Suns, is this. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? Okay, one person. Cool. There is this cauldron which you can use to brew consumables that you use, again, during the tactical layer of the game. The ingredients for those potions come from exploring your home base. Now, you might start seeing at this point where the problem comes. We're completely cutting out what the players actually want to be doing in this game, and we close a loop that's happening completely outside of the main draw of the game. I didn't mind going to explore the Abbey grounds the first time around, but being asked to then go back out and go through places I've already seen just to look for a mushroom that I can then use to craft a consumable is no. I have completely disengaged from this part of the game and have not done this at all. Fortunately, those consumables are very optional in my experience so far, so it hasn't been a major issue. But the reasons that I just pointed out of how this game is asking you to spend your time are a big part of why, if you look at reviews for Midnight Suns, a lot of them agree on the fact that it's a game that a lot of the reviewers would wholeheartedly recommend half of. Those were the 3 things that I wanted to mention in terms of what is important. So the cost to develop, the cost for players to learn your thing, and then the cost that you're actually incurring on them to actually be engaging in it. And now I wanted to mention a couple of common pitfalls. And if you've seen the excerpt for this talk, you might suspect what they are. But the first one is character progression, specifically as it relates to skill trees. Now, if you're making an RPG, this obviously makes sense. Feedback for Path of Exile, all right. So it obviously makes sense for making an RPG. An RPG you build from the ground up with the idea that players are supposed to make their own character in the way that they want. Open world games also have tended to, especially lately, dip into character progression and skill trees, and I get it. You want to gate the world somehow. Player power level is one way to do this. So the game's asking you to go out, explore more, fight more guys, level up, gain cool abilities, sure. When we get into linear, narrative-driven games, though, I start seriously questioning the wisdom of including skill trees, which means basically we're ceding control to the player of how the character will develop, what kinds of abilities they're going to have when they face whatever tailored threat we've designed for them at this part in the game. This is not to say we should never do this, but the way that I've managed to define it for myself, a game needs to have enough stuff for progression to be able to act upon without the different nodes on that skill tree feeling either underwhelming and unexciting or completely game warping. A couple of examples again. Let's look at Jedi Survivor again. So that game has about 75 nodes on its progression trees. But Jedi Survivor also happens to have a health bar, which you can modify the length of, a force bar, which you can modify the length of, a healing system, which you can modify in a couple of different ways, and that's just the boring stuff. You also have 5 different lightsaber combat styles, which you can upgrade separately with special moves. It has 6 different force powers that you can upgrade to get more efficiency out of them. So it has stuff for its progression to act upon. Compare this with Plague Tale, the second Plague Tale Requiem, which has not 1, but 2 separate progression systems. Well, one is the skills thing, which happens based off of how you play, and the other is the crafting, which is how you choose to spend resources in order to upgrade your character. Now, Plague Tale has neither a health system, you get 2-shotted in that game, first hit puts you to the ground, second hit kills you, nor a particular resource that you use to fuel your abilities. It has 2 weapons, a sling and a crossbow, and then it has a bunch of different ammunition types which you can use. The things that this progression does, though, are, for example, it gives you the ability to carry more ammunition, which sounds exciting until you realize that you're able to craft ammunition on the fly. So the fact that I'm able to carry 15 as compared to 10 really doesn't matter that much, because when I run out of 10, I just open the radial menu and I craft real-time whatever I need. So it's an example of an upgrade slot that I'm really ambivalent about. There is another one that lets you throw things farther away. Because this is a skill tree and the game can't actually force you to know this skill, the game is designed so even if you don't have it, you're able to do whatever you need to. So the fact that I'm all of a sudden able to throw things farther, I don't care. And then on the other end of that is the crossbow. So the crossbow is a very powerful weapon in the game. It allows you to one-shot pretty much anything. What it's limited by is the fact that its ammunition is not craftable. You have to find it, and it's kind of rare. So you should use it only in dire circumstances, essentially. Until you get to the final upgrade of the crossbow, which tells you your crossbow bolts are now recoverable. Once you get this, Plague Tale changes from a stealth action game into a kick doors in, shotgun guys, go collect my bolts, kick down the next door, and shotgun the next guys. So not everybody is going to get that upgrade, so they can't really make the game assuming you're going to have it. So they design it around the fact that you have to be able to stealth through this. So when I get this upgrade, and there's 4 enemies in this particular encounter, because that's how stealth works, I have 15 bolts for my crossbow. So even if I'm just going blind, I can just probably get 4 guys and then go collect my bolts and then do the same thing in the next area. Which is why if it were up to me, Plague Tale would not have had this much player freedom in order to choose their own upgrades. It would have probably had a progression that was designed by the developer and given out to the player as it becomes relevant. So yes, you do feed the player something new to do over time, but you don't give them the freedom that either feels meaningless or completely game warping. And I understand why people do this. Games today seem to all have progression. So it's become sort of players are going to expect it, and if my game doesn't have it, I'm going to get marked down. But really, there are more than a few examples of games that are both critically acclaimed and fan favorites that don't have progression. Hellblade has 0 progression to speak of. It Takes Two changes the game periodically. The characters don't get stronger, they just become different every once in a while, which is an amazing way to actually vary the game up for your players. And then Unravel 2 takes the approach of it feeds players whatever new ability that the developers have decided is now relevant for the game, so it keeps it fresh, it keeps you having to learn new things and perform new, tie new knots. But it's not up to the players to decide I'm going to take this now or not, because those games don't need it. They're not about becoming more powerful, and not all games that we play are about becoming more powerful. Skill trees mostly would feed into games that do, and games that have enough to warrant it. The other pitfall that I see way more often than I think I should is crafting. We already touched upon it with Plague Tale, but crafting obviously makes sense in Minecraft. It's in the name. But crafting in Minecraft is actually exciting. When you craft a new pick, you're able to mine a new type of block, which then makes you, enables you to craft a new thing, which you couldn't before. Because you're able to mine this type of block, you're able to actually open your way down some caverns that you couldn't before, so you're now able to explore these other places as well. It's an exciting form of crafting. It opens the game up for you. Most games, when they do crafting, it's a chore. It's like, well, we have the game and it works perfectly, but then we want to ask you to do more, so we're going to put crafting here, so I actually have to go out and do more. Open world games are a good example of this, but even among games that do the chore type of crafting, there are better and worse ways to implement it. Let's take a look at Valhalla for a second. Valhalla asks you to upgrade your gear. So again, like character progression, when you're going down the golden path, you reach a point at which, I'm not quite strong enough to progress here. I'm going to go do more stuff, upgrade my gear, so I become stronger, and I'm able to progress. I get it. But the way in which Valhalla has implemented this kind of crafting is something I appreciate. So what you need is you need, roughly speaking, iron and leather in order to upgrade your stuff. Iron you can get from mining iron deposits, and leather you can get from hunting animals, which is a very grindy approach to this. Fortunately, the main way that you get these two resources is from resource chests, which you find inside military locations, which is what Assassin's Creed Valhalla is all about. It's about doing those kinds of military locations. So really, to be able to craft and to be able to become stronger, all the game is asking you to do is really just play more of it, which, if you're somebody who enjoys the core loop of Assassin's Creed, should be fine. Now let's take a look at Horizon Forbidden West again for a second. It has two separate crafting loops that I identify within that game. The first one is the crafting loop that has you upgrading weapons and crafting ammunition. This one is very similar to Valhalla in that it asks for machine parts. Machine parts you get from hunting machines, which is what that game is all about. So this is fine. Basically, you're not strong enough. The game tells you, well, go hunt some more machines, and you're going to get stronger. If you enjoy playing Horizon Forbidden West, you probably enjoy hunting machines. Even if it asks for rare machine parts from like strong machines, that's fine. That's just a challenge for you, one that you might enjoy. And then there's crafting bags, ammo pouches, quivers, that kind of thing. Those come from wildlife. Wildlife are foxes and lizards and that kind of thing, which have one thing that they live for, and that is to run away from the player. It is not fun, I cannot emphasize this enough, it is not fun to be chasing a fox through a world just to kill it. It presents no challenge, it is annoying, it takes me off the way that I want to be going in a bad way. It's not like, okay, I need to be going there, but I should go hunt some machines, so I'm going to go there. It's, fox, I'm going to go get it. And then the fox goes, I saw you, and it leaves. So then you need to chase it down. The drops from those things are unreliable, so basically I need to go and grind wildlife in order to be able to upgrade my pouches. No, thank you. This game, much like Plague Tale, allows me to craft stuff on the fly, so you know what? I'm not going to increase my quiver size by 5. Instead, I'm just going to craft arrows when I need them. Completely disengaged with this. And I understand that they try to do something different and try to give you something else to do other than hurt machines, but this game has humanoid enemies. Why not introduce a resource that's specific to humanoid enemies that is used for crafting these bags, and then ask the player, you know what? Go do those kinds of locations now if you want to upgrade your bags. That would have been in line with the main loop of the game, and it would have made sense. All right, now that we've talked about the pitfalls, it's time to talk about my approach, and it's super boring. I have a little checklist that I go through whenever I look at a feature and try to evaluate it. The checklist looks at if whatever feature is being implemented and the way that it's being implemented feeds into the core gameplay of the game, whether it feeds the main fantasy of the game, so what we want the players to feel and experience, and whether it opens up design space. So that final point is really about, does this thing add something new, but not like new outside of the core gameplays of the game, new in terms of it varies up the core gameplays in interesting ways, because if it doesn't, then why are we making it if it's just more of something we already have? To talk to you about these things, I want to give you 3 examples from my career. They're all recent. The first one is the assaults in AC Valhalla. So the assaults were these large-scale battles against fortified settlements. As to the fantasy, yes, Vikings did in fact assault fortified settlements. The very reason for the existence of this feature was that we were specifically tasked to create this kind of gameplay that would support the fantasy of the player going out with their clan and conquering a settlement. So the fantasy checkpoint was done by default, pretty much. What you see the player doing during assaults is mostly fighting, but also some parkour in order to be able to get to some defensive fortifications and take them down, like the burning oil, some ballistae, sabotage of portcullis, that kind of thing. So it was feeding into what Assassin's Creed is all about. And then what was the new thing that it introduced? It was mostly about the feel, about delivering on the fantasy of these big, large-scale battles that really playing alone as a Viking doesn't deliver to you. And even the raids, which were small bands of people going to raid small villages, didn't deliver quite this feeling of a massive battle. But the reason I'm bringing assaults up is because I want to tell you a bit about the history of assaults and how they actually ended up where they are. They weren't always this. Assaults started off with actually 2 separate phases to them. There was supposed to be a strategic phase before the battle phase. In order to understand the strategic phase, I need to tell you a bit about the way Valhalla works. So you have this settlement in England, and what you're trying to do is you're trying to forge alliances with the surrounding territories in order to establish your settlement. To do that, you're doing quests in those territories that culminate in assaults. So the initial thinking was, so what if doing those quests would actually reward us with better or more siege equipment or people who would help you, like a detachment of archers with fire arrows, something like this. And so then at the beginning of an assault, you would get a top-down tactical screen where you decide, okay, so I'm going to put my ram in front of the gate, I'm going to put 2 ladders to the side towers, then I'm going to put a detachment of archers over here, and then you'd hit play and you'd start playing the assault. Very early on, we figured out that this is not why people play Assassin's Creed. They don't want to be rubbing their forehead going, do I need to deploy the archers on this hill over here or on this ruined tower over here? So over here, they would actually cover the ballistae, but over here, they would actually be countering the enemy archers, so which is more beneficial to me? This is the kind of thing that I was talking about earlier about introducing complexity that really doesn't pay off at the end, because we're asking the player to essentially learn the setup phase of a Total War game, and then having them play Assassin's Creed, which was too big of an ask. It didn't work out. Assaults actually had a second thing different about them, though, before they ended up as that. They were systemic. So an assault would start, and something that we used to call balance of power would kick in, which was the overall performance of defenders and attackers pushing against each other. This was naturally weighted a bit in the favor of the defenders, so they would be pushing the attackers out, and it would be up to the player to then come in and supply the difference to push the assault to completion. That was a great idea, and it sounded really interesting, and so we prototyped it and we started playing around with it. And in playtest, we found 2 things. First of all, well, it was something that we knew, but this introduced a fail state to the game, which was different to anything else. The only way you can fail in Assassin's Creed Valhalla is if you die. All of a sudden, we introduced this fail condition for assaults that was like, well, you can die or your assault can fail. So we needed to explain that to players somehow. And also, because it was systemic and things were happening all over the battlefield, you could end up in the situation where you are doing very well at some place, you're hacking away at guys, you're bringing down the gate with the ram, but because you didn't pay attention to a couple of other places, the balance of power actually shifted far enough against you that you lost the assault, which created a very unpleasant feeling that you thought you were doing well, but then the assault failed, which then actually started asking the players to engage in battlefield management, which was, how are you guys doing? All right, I'm going to go over there and see how those guys are doing. which is not really, again, the fantasy that we're trying to sell for you being a Viking leader leading your clan into battle. You're not some general sitting in the back going, you guys forward, you guys retreat, you guys hold. It's about you getting both of your axes out and jumping into the fray. So this is what we ended up with, basically. Assaults, in the end, are big, massive, exotic quests, essentially, with a series of objectives that you need to go through, but they are all focused on the theater in which you are currently acting. They feel very visceral, and as long as you're doing something, whether it's killing guys or manning the ram to bring down the gate yourself, you're helping the assault to progress, and unless you die, everything is going to be fine. Which basically ended up with the assaults being these highlights of gameplay that we have in the final game. The next thing that I want to talk about brings us into the Dawn of Ragnarok DLC. The Odin Powers. So the Dawn of Ragnarok DLC has you playing as Odin, or Havi as he's called in the DLC, rather than Eivor, who is the main character of Valhalla. So very early on we knew, well, we needed to somehow differentiate Odin from Eivor. Like, Odin is this deity, he's an Norse god, so we needed something to sell that fantasy. And what we settled on were the Odin Powers. So the Odin Powers allow Odin to take the characteristics of enemies and use them for his own purposes. This was, we dug into Norse mythology, basically, and we found out that Odin's favorite trick was to basically not be recognized by others. He could appear as different people, essentially, throughout the different myths, and in the end, it was Odin all along, gotcha. So this is what we basically interpreted as his ability to get different characteristics from different enemies and use them for his own. 3 of the 5 Odin powers actually have him shape-shifting, but we extended this a bit further to actually be able to cover all of the core gameplays of the game. The Odin powers do cover all 4 major gameplays that we have in Assassin's Creed Valhalla. So they covered combat, they covered stealth, they covered navigation, and they covered exploration. The power of the raven up top allowed Odin to turn into a raven, which allowed him to traverse big distances over land, or in the air as it were, get a good view of whatever the territory was, and allowed him to reach places he wouldn't be able to otherwise. With some upgrades, it allowed Odin to conduct air assassinations and basically fall down on a guy and assassinate him. The powers of Muspelheim and Jotunheim, respectively, so the powers of the fire giants and the ice giants, allowed Odin to assume the form of a fire giant or a frost giant, and acquire some characteristics that those enemies have in the game. From the ice giants, Odin got the ability to teleport. From the fire giants, he gets the ability to walk on lava, essentially. When he shapeshifts into those forms, this allows him to perform social stealth, essentially. It allows him to not be noticed by enemies. And the teleport thing allowed us to create setups in which basically you zip around the battlefield teleporting. With an upgrade, you can start assassinating with teleport. And firewalking allowed you to access areas that you couldn't otherwise. And then the 2 combat-related things, the power of rebirth and the power of frost, which isn't unlocked in this screenshot, were again fire and ice aligned, but they were pure combat glory. Basically, they made you super powerful in combat and capitalized on the visceral feeling of fight. So they covered all of the gameplay elements, but the new design space, what did they bring to the game? I touched upon this earlier, but basically they allowed us to build locations in a way that we hadn't been able to before. We were able to have these floating monoliths in the sky, which you couldn't access in any other way outside of the Raven form. So you'd be able to fly up there and explore that kind of location. We were able to create locations that were meant to be explored top-down instead of bottom-up, because you could access them from the top. The teleport power allowed us to create entrances that were odd, that required you to do odd angles in order to be able to access a place and not just come in through the front door. The 2 stealth powers allowed us to create stealth setups that didn't rely on the normal stealth elements like tall grass or covers, but they just didn't have them. You had to shift into a particular form in order to be able to gain access to an area. So they did very much manage to impact all areas of gameplay and give them something more. Even the combat ones actually allowed us to step past what was considered internally before to be the hard setup in terms of archetypes and number of enemies, because the combat powers really did push the limit of what Odin was able to do in combat. The last thing that I want to touch upon is probably the feature that I'm low-key most proud of, and that was Kara's domain, the Valkyrie Arena inside of Ragnarok. So arenas, in general, aren't something new to Assassin's Creed. They've been around at least since Origins. And they're essentially a place where you go, you select, I want to fight some guys, and you fight some guys. This is also the gameplay bit, so it ties with the fight of the game. It's something that we've already proven in previous games that, yes, it's a thing that players would engage in. So the core gameplay was fine. It also actually took full advantage of the Odin Powers, so it was even more leaning into something that we created for the DLC specifically. The fantasy of it was that there was this Valkyrie who was in the Dwarven realm, which was invaded by giants, so there was a lot of death, and she was collecting souls for Valhalla and Ragnarok. Odin rolls around, and being the braggart that most Norse gods are, he says, cool, let me tell you some stories about how awesome I am so you can inspire the new recruits. So what's happening in this arena, essentially, is Odin is recounting his greatest battles, and Kara, the Valkyrie, is manifesting them so he can relive them for her. This had a cool little twist to how this actually works, though, because in order for you to unlock the different scenarios that you're able to play, you have to first defeat those enemies for real. They actually have to be defeated by Odin, so he's able to tell that story to Kara, and she's able to manifest that soul for him to fight. My favorite part about the arena, though, was the inclusion of the boasts. Not only is Odin boasting about how awesome he is about fighting those enemies, he also doesn't shy away from saying, and I was blind drunk when I did it. So we have these boasts that you're able to collect throughout the DLC, and what they do is they allow players to modify the difficulty of this arena themselves in a custom and interesting way. Interesting in terms of it's not just enemies deal more damage and they have more health. Interesting in the form of you start the fight drunk, and every time you try to heal, you get more drunk. Interesting in the way that you can't stun enemies anymore, so you can't do the big finishing moves on them unless you're using a hammer or basically a blunt weapon. So we were able to create this arena where players could try out different interesting combinations and create very unique play experiences. Using this, we were also able to address something we found out after the release of Valhalla, which was that players tended to find a weapon that they like, find a playstyle that they like, and stick to that no matter how many more cool legendaries they ended up finding. So if you find a pair of cool legendary daggers and you go, I'm the 2 daggers guy, you start playing 2 daggers. And then no matter how many Dane axes or great swords or whatever else you find, you just sort of put it in your bag and you don't care about it because you're the 2 daggers guy. That's your preferred playstyle and that's what you do. With the boasts, we actually created a boast that targeted every single playstyle that we could think of to make it less efficient, if not outright unplayable. So, if you are the 2 daggers guy, specifically for you, we have the reflective damage boast, which means that every time you damage an enemy, that enemy turns on about a 5-second Thorns aura, essentially. So any damage you deal in those 5 seconds gets reflected back onto you as well. This then makes the 2 daggers guy go, this is not very efficient. I should get a slow, hard-hitting weapon, so hit a guy once, the Thorns aura comes on, and then by the time I charge my next attack against him, it's off again, so I smack him again. If I do quick attacks against the guy, yes, I do some damage, and then the thing turns on, and I do a lot of damage to myself as well. If you are the big hammer guy, we have the initial damage shield boast, which says that enemies start off with a shield that cancels the first instance of damage against that enemy. So 2 daggers works very well against that because any particular hit from the daggers doesn't do a lot of damage. It's the combo that's going to add up. And if you're using slow weapons, a lot of that gets negated. You like dodging and counterattacking? You have the dodging trade-off boast, which makes it so that after every dodge, the first successful attack deals no damage. So all of a sudden, we were taking all of these playstyles and all of these outfits that the player might be using and telling them, you should try something new. And we did actually observe that the arena was a fan favorite among many players. People didn't appreciate the grind that it asked them to do in order to be able to buy everything in the arena, but the gameplay itself was something that was very fun, and it actually did have people changing up their gear and their playstyles to get it. So that's it. It's very basically, how does a new feature fit your core gameplays? How does it fit the fantasy that you're trying to sell? And what new does it allow you to do? It's as simple as that. And that's what I try to use when I'm measuring new features and how to implement them in the games. As we started off at the beginning, about time. In the era of AAA games and beyond, games are getting so much bigger and so numerous that we really should start paying attention to how we're asking our players to spend their time. You know this saying, the more the merrier? When it comes to design, I'd say it's the more the messier. So we really need to find a way to focus and deliver the experience that players are actually expecting to find in our game, and it's completely okay to have side things as well, as long as they're not going to take up a lot of the players' cognitive effort and a lot of the players' time. Because yeah, sure, there can be something refreshing to do on the side, but the players bought our game because they wanted to get a particular experience out of it. The best way to do that is to stick to your pillars, know your core loop, because they're ultimately the best benchmark you have to look at your game and decide if what you want to implement fits. And it's the best way to make sure that all of those moving parts and all of those puzzle pieces create the coherent picture that all of our players deserve. Thank you.
Hi, I'd have one. Because I don't remember what was on the checklist that you had, but I kind of had a feeling like most of mini games that we have in games do not fit those. Yet, or maybe I'm wrong, yet some of them are extremely successful. Like, for example, most of the mini games are totally not along with the fantasy that you're selling. Like, for example, because what you have shown in, say, Valhalla is pretty much digging deeper into the fantasy that this game sells. And minigames, say a card game in an RPG, is a totally different thing. So I'd say they don't fit the points, yet some of them are like, super successful.
So that's why I started with them in that if we have mini-games, sure, it's fine, but just make them small and don't ask too much of the player. There is one notable exception to this that I purposely didn't include in this presentation, and it's Gwent. Yes. So Gwent is a game, it is a mini game inside of The Witcher, but playing Gwent, you can beat The Witcher, essentially. So the impact of the mini game on the experience is major. Basically, you can decide, I'm not going to fight monsters. Whenever somebody comes to me and is like, you, sir, you're like, pull out the cards. You can choose to play The Witcher this way. So the impact of Gwent on the core, on playing the game is major. And with all its intricacies, Gwent is ultimately, I need to have more numbers on my side than you have on yours. So it's not as complex as Machine Strike, and it has a much bigger impact on the game than Machine Strike. So, Holotactics, for example. Holotactics fits the fantasy of Star Wars because you've seen it in movies. So having it is fine in terms of fantasy. In terms of core gameplays, absolutely not, but it's such a minor thing, it's such a minor investment on the player's side that, sure, this is why at the end I said, like, focus on those big things, and if you include something else, that's fine, but just make sure it's mini, that being the operative word.
Yeah, I had actually Gwent in mind, but being CDPR, I thought it was not very elegant to actually point it out.
Hello, thank you for your great talk. As far as Gwent is concerned, I would also mention that it has a power fantasy to it. So the more you play it, the more powerful you become, and that was a design decision. So actually, Geralt gets more powerful, and your deck gets more powerful as well. But changing the subject back to Assassin's Creed. So I've played a lot of Assassin's Creed. I love Assassin's Creed. And Assassin's Creed, one of the things that I absolutely love about it is that from game to game, it takes chances on some things, right? Some things are successful, Other things are not so successful, but I feel like it never strays from trying to do something, right? And my question to you would be, how do you determine where to take that chance? Because me personally, this is just my opinion, of course, with the example that you've provided for the strategic layer of the Assassin's Creed, I think I would very much appreciate it as a player because Valhalla had the biggest density of melee combat in any of the Assassin's Creed, and I would welcome the change, like I did, for example, in Black Flag, by just sailing the ship around. And I'm wondering, where do you make that call, that this doesn't fit, and we cannot even attempt it, or we don't want to even explore this? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. So we started off with the idea to design it, so we very much felt the same. So this sounds like a cool thing to do. We had, because no longer with Ubisoft, but we used to have this editorial body above us, which basically has a much wider view of our player base and what they enjoy in our games and what things are good to try. Having a tactical layer to that is having a tactical layer to a mandatory gameplay segment. So if assaults were a side type of activity, something that you can engage in, sure, I suspect it might have been fine to say, let's try it out there. But because they were such a core fantasy requirement for us to have, we couldn't really roll the dice on, well, is the tactical layer going to work? Assaults themselves already, in Odyssey, we had big battles. Assaults essentially took the learnings from big battles and adapted them into something more, which were the assaults. So we kind of had the idea that this is going to work. We are going to push it in terms of creating all of the different siege weapons that you use, ladders, rams, all of those things. So we were pushing in that direction, and we decided to not then go with the tactical layer. So I wouldn't be surprised if, moving forward, if the feature ever comes back, knowing that it is successful the way it is, people then decide to try out that other element to it or to some non-mandatory types of assaults. But when it came to the core fantasy, which we had to sell, of you being a Viking leader, introducing a completely different game genre, essentially, because that is total war. We're figuring out where to put your archers and all of this is not what Assassin's Creed players are generally looking to play.
Thank you.
Hello, great talk. I will be a bit politically incorrect and a bit bold, but I bought this business pass because I wanted to meet great experts in the matter like yourself. I'm trying to start my own game, my own studio, and actually, don't take it personally, but I sent you a private message to in the application to meet with you. You didn't respond. That's okay. So I want to take the advantage of this question to propose you if you would agree to meet with me in the business area today.
Sure.
And I would like to get feedback from you about my game.
Absolutely.
Yeah? Thank you. Thank you. I will just wait and...
Sure, absolutely.
Thank you.
All right, lunch is at 1, so don't let me hold you anymore.